Consequence, there's been a great deal of suffering and loss, painful loss, down through the years. You know, how many people, how many bleached bones on hillsides have become the permanent and eternal repository of some of the greatest dreams the human race has ever envisioned? How many slaves have died longing to be free, and then wishing for their children to only have their children die a similar fate? Where do these dreams go, man, when we breathe our last breath? Where do these aspirations go? What happened? The accumulated weight of these disappointments. And it raises the question of God at significant points, because why would a God that is all good torment us by filling our head with ideals that he knows he did not equip us, or she did not equip us to realize? What kind of God would torture a slave with the idea of justice, knowing that we never live long enough to experience it? These are other levels of the problem of evil that are implicated in the kinds of ideas that we are pursuing. So I'm a pessimist in that sense, but an iron-eating pessimist, who in the face of all the failures press on still, not because I'm optimistic, but just because there's no better option. And then in the end, there's something in my thinking and in me that suggests that is God. It is the pessimist who sees the potential and the likelihood of the failure and the disintegration of our highest ideals and the undermining of our highest motivations. And it is the pessimist who sees in the face of all that still they linger. Who better than the pessimist to really sense, to intuit, to intimate the possibility of something eternal in the race? So yes, I'm a pessimist, but I'm a faithful pessimist who believes in the pessimism of strength. So thank you for that provocation. Today we're going to start talking about God in earnest. So it's in here too. Friedrich Nietzsche, son of a Lutheran pastor, the most religious of all continental European philosophers and existentialists, the most deeply spiritually penetrating philosopher of the modern age. Probably, for my liking, one of the finest theologians of the era. There is a sense in which Nietzsche's handling of words, I think, is sometimes intentionally untrustworthy. Nietzsche is evocative of profound ambiguity, his thinking, and I think it's intentional. I think that the way in which we refer to him as an atheist is not unambiguous, as you can see from this text. But there are people who consider themselves atheists because they do not believe in the standard Western conception of God. Some people call themselves atheists because they have dismissed religion as socially and culturally and psychologically harmful. So when people use this term atheist, they're not often very accurate about what they mean, because they're not very clear to themselves. People like to use the term atheist because it sounds like a strong term. But it is not a strong term if it is lightly misused, used lightly or misused. It's not a strong term, but it sounds like a strong philosophical position. Many people use atheist as an alternative to blind belief, and they often juxtapose atheism with blind belief, immature faith, various forms of fundamentalism. As a matter of fact, most scientific atheists, no, all of them, usually select the straw man of the narrowest, most childish understanding of religion as a conversation partner to prove how irrational faith is, as if somehow we are bound and shackled to the lowest common denominator of thinking when it comes to religion, that somehow we're obligated. We're not just likely to, we're obligated to be stupid, just so they can show how smart they are. My ears probably turning red because I enjoyed as a graduate student destroying those kinds of people. I did it with relish. They hated to see me coming. The religious people say, "Here comes Matt now, here comes Matt, go here comes me." And I enjoyed it. Well, I was a philosophical theologian, and of course, our emphasis was arguments for the existence of God. So we knew you have to know your enemy. I don't think anybody knows enough to prescribe for me what I can and can't use as supported documentation for my God hypothesis. You can't make rules that I can't use evidence or use inductive reasoning, when we know that science does that all the time, and scientists are quite often wrong. You don't hear about the great, listen, I think it was Einstein who pointed out in an interview, came across this as one of his biographies, but you don't hear about the paper, you seldom hear about the papers when they were wrong. And they all wrote wrong papers. You just hear about the right one, or the earth-shaking one. But the ones where their hypotheses were wrong, you suddenly hear about, because nobody's interested in those. Okay? So there is no foolproof reasoning in any area or any field. We have a right to reason about God. We are not confined to Barth's narrow revelational limitations on revelation, although we recognize revelation as a potential source of knowledge about God. But we also realize as thinkers that revelations can make competing claims, and therefore we must resort to the court of reason to arbitrate those claims, to come up with a sound choice, may not necessarily be right, but a reasonable choice on which one's most likely to be correct, or which one fits the data as we understand it better. It's okay to reason like that about God. We don't have to accept this stupidity label and tag. Now, I think Nietzsche, in a sense, would be considered an atheist even in his own era, if people consider atheists, if they did not accept or was not friendly disposed toward traditional and establishment religion and conceptions of God. Or if they weren't Christian, or...
Could you say that again?
Probably not.
Okay.
Considered atheist if you didn't accept broadly the standard framework for thinking about God. So that you'd be considered an atheist. It's sort of like the evil monkey in Family Guy. just have to kind of point at you. But I think Nietzsche understood something. This is he understood that something was failing. That this whole civilizational fantasy was a house of cards. Now, really, when you think about it, after you, who was in my science and religion class? Right. After you get to the 17th, 18th century, you start running into serious problems reconciling the traditional standard conception of God to things that they're finding out about the universe, because their understanding of God was so fundamentally grounded in scriptural testimony. Okay, so it begins to get a little shaky, and God becomes, for intellectuals at least, in many ways, deistic. As a matter of fact, God becomes more and more like the ideal posture of the scientist. Who was it? Xenophanes, who said if horses had gods, they'd look like horses. Cows had gods, they'd look like cows. Zebras had gods, God would have stripes. Men make gods so they look like them. And also women make gods so they look like them. Goddesses. All right, so in a sense, we tend to create these images of God. It's just a curious image of God coming out of the 17th, 18th century, that God begins to look like this detached, mechanical wizard. Of course, for some, God looked like Herr Frankenstein. Those that were conscious of the suffering. So there's always two sides to this thing. You look like a mechanical wizard who constructs a perfectly ordered universe where means are marvelously adapted to ends. Or the God who creates a world that becomes unchained and runs amok, like Frankenstein. So the scientist, Newton on one hand, Dr. Frankenstein on the other. As a romantic challenge. And I think Nietzsche was affected by it, of course he was, by the whole romantic challenge to the rationalism of standard continental European philosophy, which of course he quoted more directly from Hegel. But Nietzsche developed the whole book. All right, so there's a sense in which I think Nietzsche sensed that the God concept didn't work. And not just didn't work as an idea. In fact, it worked fairly well as an idea for a while until we destroyed it. The problem was, I'm thinking, I'm giving a broad thing, then we're going to come to birth of tragedy. I'm thinking that Nietzsche understood that the assumptions of Western civilization, the moral assumptions, the moral framework was grounded, tied, rooted, integrated with the presumptive assumption of the traditional understanding of God. I say presumptive because once it is no longer presumed, once a question is fundamentally raised, it is the proverbial Pandora's box. It cannot go back in the bottle. You don't have to, you can answer it any way you want, but once it becomes the subject of question, once people become free to question, then the idea destabilized as the presumptive anchor of a culture. And Nietzsche, more than the theologians, because he was a pessimist, understood we're in trouble. If God goes and God's gone, we're in trouble. But throughout the writings of Nietzsche, there's a couple of things, even when he's questioning the epistemological orientation. There is still, even when he's expressing pessimism about truth, there is still this desire for it and pursuit of it. And there's something deeply ethical in the sense of Nietzsche's creativity when it comes to his explorations of what it means to live. In this new existential landscape that has emerged at the death of the Western God. How do you come to terms with what life means in this landscape that's in which it's in devastation, moral and ethical devastation? Now, it's one thing to live in a world where God was never assumed. Like the early Greek philosophers' world where it was created out of a void. They're atheists. God was never. It's another thing to live in a world where God was and now no longer is. It's a kind of vacuum. So that you start living with the presence of a divine absence. See, Nietzsche at best was a philosophy in the shadow of God. Nietzsche was a philosophy written in the shade of God's tombstone. God may not have been directly present in Nietzsche, but God's absence was. He was a God-haunted philosopher. Western society is a God-haunted culture. Nietzsche sensed this, I think. This is what he was saying in The Madman. So haunted. What was Shakespeare getting at in the beginning of Hamlet if it was not the haunted nature of Western culture? Why this obsession with the Gothic in the 19th century, just when this sense of God's dysfunction, the concept of God's dysfunction comes to the fore, you get this Gothic thing. It's a God-haunted culture. Holy Ghost. This came up in a discussion with my baby daughter. She brought it up. She texted me the other day and said, "Hey, Dad," after we had a conversation, she said, "You notice that the German word," and she gave me the German word, for intellectual history is the same word for ghost story. She is so damn smart. I mean, it's spooky. She doesn't even, is one of these people who not thinking about being smart, doesn't care. Like, it's sort of like my second daughter was allergic to peanuts. They could kill her. They still can. But my oldest daughter, who was about 2, would give them to her. And one day we came in, and my second daughter was in her bassinet, balancing a peanut on her tongue. I don't know why God arranged, well, I don't know why things are arranged that people are most prolific having babies when they are least capable of caring for them properly. They had no business with children. We were kids. There she was, it was 4 fools in one place. She was just balancing the peanut on her thumb. That's how my baby is with these very difficult ideas. Just totally. He did. I'm like, this is supposed to be difficult. And she talks about some of her professors, devastating critiques. And so I casually said, you didn't say that in class, did you? She said, no, I know better than that, But still, I raised a question, though. I think they knew what I was getting at, and I let it go. I was like, oh, so anyway, ghost story. Now, this is related to something else that I can't say because she's 23 or 4, she's already doing original, she's seeing original stuff. So I'm like, And the third one, she's graduating with a PhD from UCLA at 27. She beat me by 2 years. She's so pleased with herself. I didn't win because I had them. So that's why I was prolonged. Now they toppled me. And it's my daughters that just toppled me.
It's okay.
Good.
Well, and my son is amused. He's amused by them toppling me. He over there in Africa trying to figure out why he's in Africa. He's breaking. But anyway, I wanted to give her credit for that. So we came up with this idea of being haunted. And then immediately it struck me, we're haunted by God. Nietzsche was haunted. How many of you remember this? It's almost like he was haunted by his father. How many, in the early death of his father, how many of you remember the scene in Amadeus? Yes. When Don Giovanni summoned, and the interpretation was that Mozart had brought his father back from the grave to condemn him.
Right.
Because he was haunted. Of course, you all know where Don Giovanni is taken from, right? The Bible. I don't care what they say. It's the story of Saul and Samuel and the Witch of Endor. That's Don Giovanni. When Saul brings Samuel back from the grave to condemn him. You ever read that story? Read that story. Don't listen to these biblical people will destroy the life of a biblical text. Don't let them do that. Let the text live. It wasn't written to be dissected before it was communicated. It was written to be communicated just as it is.
As it is.
Which is right back to where we are, right? In the 18th and 19th century, where science was looking for the meaning of life. But the process of finding it killed the thing they were in search of. By the time you dissect the frog, the life is gone. I think that's what you do with the concept of God, but I'll wait on that before I go any further into that. Okay, Nietzsche. We're haunted by God. If you look at the end of the Madman, right? He said, what are these churches today if they're not sepulchres? Churches are like hauntings. Spaces, hauntings. Walking through our civilization is like walking through a graveyard. One big body. Western concept of God came crashing to the earth like a giant. like the giant in Jack and the Beanstalk. Isn't it interesting that he went up to the beanstalk, went up into heaven, found a big giant up there and killed it? I said that was fascinating theologically. What are these theories if they're not so many beanstalks grown from magical assumptions? Alas, but we'll let Jack rest a moment. Back to Nietzsche. But I don't think Nietzsche had a sense of the value of life. And in fact, when he got these God's cataracts off of his eyes, he was clearer about the value of life. Because there's so much to this traditional understanding of God that's like theological cataracts. They cloud everything, including the value of people. We spend so much time being conceptually right about God that it's spiritually meaningless. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And a lot of people become atheists for that reason, and they confuse the vacuous nature of religion with the bankrupt nature of the idea of God. They're not the same. Because our religion has been emptied of life does not make God bankrupt, spiritually bankrupt. Just because there's no money in your bank don't mean there ain't no gold in Fort Knox. I don't think, at least at this point of the birth of tragedy, that Nietzsche was ready to surrender the divine. As a matter of fact, he never quite surrendered it, even though he localized the godness in human beings, a race of human beings. Became for some people races. But the whole image of the affirmation of the instincts is a recognition of the value of life in life itself. Who was that? Eric knows.
Affirmation of life.
Yes.
Life itself.
Yes. Yes. Because listen, there is a point at which, and this is going to bring us into two key concepts. There's a point at which the authentic religious impulse, and I think this is what's magnificent about the modern world. The authentic religious impulse wants God to have something to do with real life. At some point.
Yeah.
Or either the idea loses its credibility. No, let's don't say yeah. Let's don't say yeah. Let's look at this. Let's look at what I'm getting at. God has very little, and neither do our values, and particularly, let's take America and this culture, to do with real life. No. We think we can impose our normative systems on life. We try to make life fit what we think. We think ought implies is. That since this is the way I think life ought to be, this is the way it is. So therefore we got to make laws and hold people ethically responsible for what I think ought to be. You find that particularly in the West, and no offense, but particularly with white folk in America. Once they decide something is right, and it meets their ethical assumptions or vision, they set about to impose on everybody this norm, and everybody is supposed to participate as if it's true.
Mm-hmm. That's what I preached in my sermon today. We were there.
If you preached what I'm saying, you were right. But you know what? Right. But here's the thing.
The Euro-American vision.
Because what does that do?
It takes the dominant culture and says that's the right way to live, and that's the right interpretation of the Bible and God. And
But what does that do?
stuffs out the it
Kills
makes
life.
that
Hmm?
Kills life.
It kills life. Yeah,
Yes.
flattens it. Makes it not meaningful. Right. Kills
But
the
what
creator.
else does it do?
Gives you a lower class of individuals that makes one better, makes
Yeah.
one worse.
Right.
Read Marcus Aurelius. Ask of each thing, what is it in itself? What does it do, Claudius? What does it do?
Okay, I'm not getting it.
It forecloses on God.
Yeah.
Yes. Let's look closer. Thank you, Claudius.
Well, yeah, it just, God becomes like all these rules and all these rules, and this is the way it is, and it just sort of falls flat.
Stay right there. Don't stop, because two things happen. When I say what does it do, what does it? It protects us.
Right. Right.
See, see, one of the problems with people.
White people. Yeah.
Yes.
The
One,
dominant.
but I want you to see how. One of the things that we don't ask ourselves is why is it so important for the oppressor to oppress? What needs does it serve?
Well, we get more resources, right?
No. Because here's part of the problem with that traditional, correct, but inflected interpretation. It is influenced by the economic determinism implicit in most critiques from the left, which don't hold water, as much water as it should, for instance, when it's put up against poor and working-class whites consistently voting against their interests to affirm a racist agenda in America. Mm-hmm. So this idea that somehow economic interests are people's interests, not just that they are the dominant interests, but that this is how you define interests,
Yes.
is problematic. Because people have other interests,
Yeah.
like psychological interests.
Right. They want to be known or felt cared about or whatever.
Stay with me now.
Yeah.
All right. So you have these other interests. But people don't take religion seriously anymore. So they lose sight of them because religion is where you see it. Because religion is where we come to understand things like altruism that defies the biological assumption that self-preservation is always our first instinct or our predominant one. Because what it may mean for me to be a self may have something essential to do with willing to sacrifice myself for the things I love. That may have something to do with myself as I define it. So that if I don't do that anymore, I die a social death, which for me is far more unbearable, and a psychological death and an existential death, which is more unbearable to me than the fear of physical non-existence. So I'd rather be dead than the other. I'd rather be dead than live with myself as the man who failed to defend his family. Because that is just a prolonged hell, a fate worse than death. So my interest can't be defined in these reductionistic, materialist terms. But it happens all the time. Now back to what does it do? These oppressive impositions, these impositions of these norms. It tells us that the world is essentially right.
Yeah.
Now what I'm getting back to is the reason why we don't do as well transforming the world as we could. The reason we don't do as well is because we assume that once you get back to the oppressor, that the oppressor is evil. So we think that's an explanation. Hell, evil ain't no explanation. Evil needs an explanation. That's why we're in this class about God. So you just can't stop at evil like you done something. Now, the oppressor is needy. Now, it may be result in evil to be that needy. But the failure to properly understand what you're looking at will definitely prohibit the development of effective methods for dealing with it. Needy. What needy? It's needy. I can't. This is for me. Needy. Needy. I need to believe that the world works out the way it's supposed to, because if it doesn't, I can't justify my exploitative position in the hierarchy.
Yep.
And moral superiority. Moral, the assumption of moral, not intellectual superiority, not material superiority, not moral superiority, is the presupposition of white racist supremacy. Because it always happens within a religious framework. I have more, I am more, because I am worth more and I deserve more. Without that, white supremacy is dysfunctional. That's why you see in television and everywhere this reinforcing, and that's why liberal fundamentalism is no different from conservative fundamentalism. It's the same white supremacy, because what it reinforces is a standard that functions to reinforce the white identity of moral supremacy. That's why at the end of the day, Bill Clinton ain't no better than George Bush. No, unfortunately, I'm sorry. But I mean, it's just a matter of policies. I'm just talking about in terms of what they operate, the assumption they operate. That's why he could comfortably say of Obama 30 years ago, this guy would have been bringing us our tea. That's why he could say that. To Ted Kennedy, no less. Yeah, he said it.
Bill Clinton said that?
Yeah, man, Bill Clinton's racist. He's from Arkansas. He's a racist.
We are all racist.
He's a Southern Baptist from Arkansas. All Southern Baptists from Arkansas are racist. I tell you what, be black and operate on an assumption otherwise and see what you get. Yeah, you got that, didn't you?
Yes, sir.
You don't operate on that assumption in Arkansas as a black person?
Okay.
See, the consequences are real. There ain't no philosophical discussion. In Minnesota either, as I have found out since I've been here.
Say, give an example or something. Can you give an example?
Called African a nigger at the end of the bar the other day. And then he was told to be quiet and not object. He was creating a disturbance. How's that for an example? I was there. I have others. I won't bore you with my story. Not a racism class. Theology class. But it serves a particular need. So you got to reinforce this. And in America, it's reinforcing an optimistic narrative.
Yes.
And for the optimistic narrative to function, it has to work out. It has to work. Things have to work out. That's why there's always a redemptive narrative. That's why I won't go watch that Salmo stuff. I'm sorry, I ain't going. You need to see that stuff. I live in Atlanta.
When you say workout, do you mean it in the context of the happily ever after?
Yes.
Okay. That we'll never see, because
Well, you may not. But I'm saying the assumption is you impose a narrative on reality that guarantees it. Because at the end of the day, we're inherently good. Which means we're inherently innocent. It means we're inherently like God. But that's a whole other class. But that's what it means. That's the way it functions. See, let me tell you, there's a difference between operative theology and discursive theology. The operative theology of American theology is innocence.
Okay. Really?
And things working out in America's favor is tied to America's sense of innocence.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's part of the moral economy.
So then the whole narrative would be never to really change that, but make it look like you are attempting to change that? Because why would you, I mean, you know, it was interesting. I mean, it would be, why would you ever really attempt to change that? If you, I mean, is it just a facade then? It's illusion where people say, well, we're going to be inclusive, we're going to, I mean, that's...
Well, let's face it.
Yeah,
Even
it's not gonna
King
happen.
wasn't talking about changing it. He was talking about making it America true to herself. The herself is the authentic self, which is the true America, which must win because the arc of the moral universe is wrong, but it bends to the judge.
Dang it, it has to be.
Yeah, well...
He's crazy.
Optimistic.
Well, we're going to talk about all this. This is grounded in certain concepts of God that we're going to get into. We're setting the groundwork for when we come to this. But some of the stuff that gets opposed to some of this is sort of where I am. All right, it ain't, listen, Porgy and Bess, I'm sporting life. It ain't necessarily so today. For me, ambiguity has to be, I hate to say it, but I'm going to say it. It's essential.
Yeah.
Ambiguity remains theologically essential. I'm just warning you about my theological position, so you know my Bible. It has to be there. That's why we're looking at a book called The God Who Made Thee. If we're lucky, but ain't no guarantee. I sure hope God is there. Because if it ain't no heaven, I wake up dead one mad black man.
Okay. That's two. Yes.
Somebody gonna give me an answer.
Well,
I ain't going nowhere.
okay.
Dr. J, you're arguing that with the ambiguity comes pessimism, right? That's the ambiguity you're talking about?
Well, I'm talking about ambiguity in general.
Like, optimism without ambiguity is dangerous, which is why you point towards pessimism.
Well, optimism for me essentially forecloses essential ambiguity. So optimism itself is contrary to conceiving of life as essentially ambiguous. But pessimism is allowed within a framework that's essentially ambiguous. There's room for it. I wouldn't want to say it's the same thing. And see, part of what ambiguity does is it frees me to live within the tension of ongoing binaries. Because I think life is non-Euclidean. I think we live in non-Euclidean fields. I don't think we live in whole numbers. I don't think we live along the edges of the square. I think we live in its diagonal. But we're going to come to that today. All right. Now, so Nietzsche still had a sense of the divine. You see somehow the divine, why is it the divine is essentially tied to our triumph? As if we don't win, there ain't no God. No, it's God, you just lose. That's it.
That's all.
like every other species that evolved and didn't make it. But we are here. See, we got all these built-in assumptions that we think naturally, once you start freeing yourself, that this naturally gives rise to this when thinking about God. You begin to liberate yourself from certain assumptions. Now let me say what's going on in the birth of tragedy. I think Nietzsche is seeing a different vision of life. It is essentially his vision. It is a tragic vision, and it is consistent throughout all of Nietzsche's works. And it first gets articulated in the birth of tragedy. Now he starts moving with the Dionysian, becomes more Dionysian, less Apollonian later. He starts playing with the concept and so forth, developing it. But it's developed, essentially his philosophy is in the birth of tragedy. Birth of tragedy is Nietzsche's philosophical, theological response to the death of God. But Nietzsche's wrestling with the tension between immanence and transcendence, I think. Now, that's a key concept. The divine immanence is God within reality. Okay? So God in the physical and human and identifiable universe. God's immanence. For instance, for me, an example of God's immanence are the healing dynamics that evolved in the liturgical framework of traditional African American worship experience that responds to the absurdity and the fragmentary nature of their existence. That those sounds that you hear in the blues, rhythm and blues, traditional gospel, the preaching are not incidental developments that are just that coalesce because of its African roots. No. I think it's drawn on African resources, European resources, and others to come up with a unique response to a unique set of circumstances. But a unique set of circumstances that uniquely discloses what human beings do at their limits, their extremities. See, I think if you start looking at people at their extremities, you come up with everybody else. I really believe it. Because we're humans. At the end of the day, that's what we are. My dean at Morehouse used to say, if you dig deep enough down in yourself, you come up in everybody else. I think if you look at human beings, so I don't care whether it's Conrad in Heart of Darkness, I don't care whether it's Nietzsche in The Birth of Tragedy, I don't care whether you're studying what African Americans did out of the horror of a slave ship where they had to deal with the nothingness. A lot of people want to say, well, they had the African gods and so forth. Let me tell you something. It's one of the worst and most difficult things to deal with is when your worldview fails you. That's one of the big things in Birth of Tragedy. What happens when your way of reasoning, see, there's different rationalities, but whatever yours happens to be is dysfunctional. It don't work. You know what happens to the Pythagoreans. You know what happens when it runs out of reason. One of the most, I can't tell you, cut off the tape because I tell you. This is salacious. You might want to cut it off. One of the most difficult, and the way it evolves in Europe into this rationalistic monstrosity of the absolute. And it's the God most of us are still operating with. Presbyterians are. He's a monster. God is a monster. Moral people, for moral reasons, reject God as God's been constructed. Good people say no to a monstrous concept and get sentenced to hell by the other good people for doing it. It's good people that came up. Rajiv loves to say this. That's the book I forgot, and I had a bunch of underlines to share with y'all. Hell is the place good people came up with to send the bad people who disagree with them. That hell was imagined by good people to have a place to send the evil people to. A place of eternal torment was devised by the best people so that the worst people would get what they deserve. Anyway, so let's see what this concept of God was.
Dr. Johnson, are you going to talk about the transcendence and immanence?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
I want to give a thick description of what we're talking about here.
Sure.
Because the transcendence, immanence thing is not, we're going to see it more pronounced when we go through the types of conceptions of God. Pantheistic, panentheistic, theistic, deistic, and so on and so forth. We're going to get to that when we get to philosophy of God. So I don't want to anticipate too much of that. But the transcendence and immanence has to do with God being internal. Okay, I'll back up. I argued for the healing dynamic in African American religion. What the healing dynamic helped to do was, basically, I'm going to give you just a quick thumbnail sketch, that if you were African American in America, you had to internalize a cultural taxonomy in order to locate where you were. In other words, you have to find yourself in your framework. But what it required African Americans to do was to internalize a cultural taxonomy that was degrading. So they had to internalize a taxonomy from which, in which they had to resist. In other words, they had to internalize a conflict. But it wasn't just that simple. It was, you have this cultural taxonomy that defines me in a certain way, so I have to resist it. So why internalize it? I don't have any option. It's in the language. And I have to locate where I am. So I got that titanic tension. Then, of course, I got the trauma of suffering, being in pain, slavery, then being consistently traumatized. The way cotton was manufactured in America required a whipping machine. I mean, we're talking about physical trauma on a regular basis. Then the trauma of not being able to protect my family. The trauma of being deserted by God or gods. All the boom, the boom, the boom. So they had to come up with, not sit down and figure out, but at that limit, because what? You have the limit now of human frameworks of meaning. So in order to keep living, there must be a response. For me, it's God. That was the response. And the way it manifested itself is in this essentially artistic response through sound that articulated their predicament, mirrored them in their predicament, and soothed them. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. And see, it's real. There's a reason why people in the modern world like it. Because post-modernity was something we all experienced. It's just that black people got there faster because we came up on the underside of modernity. We didn't come up there where all these ideals and promises were. We came up on the underside where we saw all the hypocrisy. So that's what post-modernity wants to talk about now. So they prefigured in our existential predicament post-modernity. All post-modernity is the maturing of the underbelly of modernity. Because they've been struggling with certainty ever since Descartes thought he was, and consequently never quite tied it down until now they've surrendered the concept of certainty, which African Americans had to live with the ambiguity, so they had to develop a method. Unanswered questions. Will I ever be free? Even when they made affirmations, oh, God loves me. Well, shit, you can't tell it by what I'm going through. Okay, so, but the healing took place. So the greatest resistance was not in carrying protest signs. It was Sunday morning worship, where we resisted the fragmentary nature of our existence and the separation anxiety and the breakdowns and the threat of insanity from loss of your children. Now, unfortunately, it let white people think that we didn't care about each other. They got away with that. They impose a situation on us that's impossible to survive. We survive it, but they can't say we do it because we're strong. They can't say we do it because we're healthy. We have to do it because we're like animals, so we don't have any real attachment to our families. That's traumatic. I'm still pissed about that shit. But I don't let it get personal. But I'm pissed that you can say that because we found a way. Because God, it lied against the Holy Spirit is what it is. And you know what the Bible says. So you have this deep affirmation, this rich affirmation that developed into a culture that makes people feel good. Everybody feels good. That feeling good is not incidental. That's healing. That's healing in your brokenness. See, for me, that was God, and I still argue this, and I argue it now. It's my theology, partly. That is God's immanence. It was in the process itself. It's God's footprint. And you see it clearly with humans at their extremes. That's why the tragic vision is truer than these alternatives. Because it develops at the extreme. And it is expressive of what Nietzsche calls, and I hope some of you have gotten there, the primordial contradiction in existence. And I want you to remember that because this is going to come up over and over and over again as people try to come to terms with the problem of suffering. Because the problem of God is always the problem of pain. Always.
Do you think that all people are going to experience pain or are going to experience in order to experience God? Experience perfect, because some people are awfully comfortable and their pain threshold. Well, I don't know, but if you only can experience God through the peripheral, through the edges, or through, that is possible for groups of people not to experience God. I assume.
Yeah, you set up a conditional tense that I'm not sure that I will completely agree with. That's if and then only. If you only, I'm not sure I'm saying only. You can experience God in you. You can experience God in horizon, in love, that soothes your pain.
But you have to pay to know that it's being soothed.
That longing. Longing carries with it its own quantum of pain. In other words, there's a quantum of pain endemic to human existence that we spend most of our lives trying to escape. So I believe. And yes, it's a very good question, and thank you for it. But I think longing is essential. Although some people experience greater deprivation, which makes the fault more pronounced. But I think longing, the pain of lack, that is necessary to drive life, is at one and the same time the reality expressed in the fall. Because the longing assumes dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction is associated with primal pain. That's why a kid's first response is crying. Because it has now encountered lack for the first time.
Yeah.
So that the satisfaction of its need is no longer immediate and automatic. Now, between need and satisfaction, there is a space. And that, it don't feel good. That's your fault. And every human being. I think disobedience is some moralistic, short-sighted, narrow, typically German kind of corruption of something much deeper. What is consistent in every interpretation of the fall? Why isn't that primary why isn't what is consistent in every differing interpretation the primary principle of interpretation? What everybody's talking about in the fall is they're trying to explain loss. Disobedience is the common explanation, but it ain't what's being explained. What's being explained is a sense of loss. As a matter of fact, the whole myth is an attempt to explain a sense of loss. We lost something. Lack. So it is that pain. Right? That's what makes our sexuality so compelling. Because there's no sharper experience of lack or ecstatic satisfaction in human experience than we find in our sexuality. It's a rehearsal of the whole thing. Our sexuality is an expression of our existential predicament and our eschatological hope. Our sexuality is the story of our redemption. Or maybe our story of redemption is an expression of our sexuality. Who knows? So that pain is essential, yes. And those people who experience less of it are epistemologically underprivileged when it comes to God. I will say that. And people who experience more of it are epistemologically privileged. That is my answer to God's strategic option for the oppressed. I don't think it's necessarily it's ethical, not moral.
Could you explain the difference between ethical and moral?
Yes. Moral has to do with the actual do's and don'ts. So when I say it's moral, the strategic option for the oppressed, it's the right thing for God to do in liberation theology. God doing the right thing. As if God exercises freedom in the same moral sense as we do. To me, it's an absurdity. God's beyond good and evil. But God is still subject to ethical theorizing. It's ethical because it has something to do with the way we experience good and evil. And it has something to do with the way the universe is made, that plays out in terms of quality of life. So in that sense, it's ethical because it has something to do with the theory of the good as we understand and experience it. But not the good and bad as prescriptions for behavior. And that's the distinction. So that if you suffer, right, you catch hell. The flower that the honeybee robs also fertilizes. If you catch hell, you are positioned to understand life a little bit better. Don't mean that you will. But if you choose to look at it through that lens, you have the likelihood of your position better to understand it. I may not use my location outside of the city to look at the sky. But if I do, I can see better than you can under lights. So it's epistemologically privileged. which frees me as a theologian from the essentialist assertion about God as, say, liberator. Not that most people would figure out that that would be a problem, because most people don't even understand when I try to explain it. What they've done with theological work now has become so ridiculous. Everybody's trying to be on the right side. Nobody's trying to be right about God or true. They should be on the right side. It's tenure, positions in these little societies we belong to, career and stuff. You know, if you want to search for truth, the best place to go is outside of the academy, and then get marginal in the church to have a shot at it. Yeah, just being honest.
So would you describe God then as the one who walks with you in your pain?
You may want to describe God that way. I tend to describe him as the one who abandoned you in it. I don't want to get there yet. I want to keep the ambiguity. See what I mean? But yes, I think that there is a coming near to those in pain. I think that's what is going on in Exodus. When Moses puts on the lips of a God character in that story, that I've come down to see about it. I think there's something about the nature of the vine that does this. You may or may not turn to it, but it does this. And that's pretty much what it does. And it's rich with resources to draw on, which in your freedom you can, or you can turn bitter, for instance. But it's an exercise of freedom. Of a freedom grounded in nothingness, emerges out of my being. So that God, in a way, participates, and that's what I think. We'll talk more about that when we get to Pajaya and Brightman and Whitehead and some other folk. So this whole walking metaphor is cool, because God is around, draws near. I've come down to see about it.
I've heard my people crying out to me.
Right? And he also said, and I saw them. So it's interesting that it's both saw and heard. It gives me a weird feeling that God had to hear. Because there's different kind of cry, right? See, here's the whole thing about pain. I knew the difference between a frustrated cry in my children and a startling pain cry. I could sit through a whole lot of straight shenanigans, 5 kids, and I'm reading. Hey. So I could sit through a lot of shenanigans. But both my wife and I immediately reacted to pain cries. They cut through something. No. They cut through everything.
Yeah.
And I wonder, this is why God is not, he doesn't go palling around with people. Maybe God's waiting for you to decide. Like Christian Mingle. You got God palling around. Maybe God thinks it's time for you to decide. You know. I'm not sure God's accessible like that. That's to me the most disgusting, childish cheapening of this great idea we started off with. great notion of the greatest idea. So God's trying to wait for you to decide. That's what God becomes for people. But I think that there is something existentially sonorous about pain that gets God's attention. Now, I'm sorry if this insults privileged people. No, not you. No. You asked the question, obviously it ain't you. But I have to look at you because it could be anybody else in here. No, it ain't you, so I can look at you and not worry about insulting. Because you raised the question. Okay. Now, that may insult privileged people who want to think that, say, their money is an indication of grace. Or their race is an indication of grace. Or, if I'm black and middle class, my achievement against the odds is an indication of grace. That's all it is, unfortunately. And God has very little to do with any of that. And nor does providence. And you come back to Nietzsche. But God does this in pain, get God's attention. I hate to use another example of Hannibal like that. Well, I have to because I think Thomas Harris is one of the most gifted theologians of the contemporary era. People don't know it because they don't read his books. They watch the movies.
So we have to read the books.
You have to. I want to do a class on this. It would be God number 2. We have to do all his books. But here's the thing. Okay? Well, no. You remember when Mason Verger is analyzing Hannibal, who is an anti-Christ figure, like antimatter? So it's complementary, not the opposite. So it's not electron-proton, it's electron-positron in terms of that. So he's an anti-Christ figure, not the antichrist in terms of. All right. So he says about Clarice, when he decides that he wants to trap Hannibal, and he does it, he says, it's the pain that excites him. When a fox hears a rabbit scream, he comes a running. But not to help. You see? Okay, it's the pain, the extremity, that brings us close to the divine. Now, it doesn't make you a good person. It can. You can turn you into a monster. That's the existential fruit. Now, I don't like time. No, I really don't. I really don't. It's an enemy. That's not really an enemy, but it's a taskmaster. Let's be back at 2:45. I'm going to pick up with the Dionysian and the Apollonian in my notes.
Dr.
Things and related to this concept of God as absolute, actus purus, impassible, free of lack of warmth, versus what we saw in the emergence of the divine, in this rich, bipolar understanding of God that Nietzsche comes up with. I'm saying of the divine. So hurry up, run back, and we'll start afterwards.
Dr. Johnson, is his struggle with eminence and transcendence combined?
So in principle, God couldn't be affected really by us.
Yeah.
So really we're left with a sociopathic lawgiver.
Yeah.
Who in a way becomes the essential patriarchal figure.
Yep.
Because there is an element of sociopathology in the assumption that somehow rules are the primary manifestation of love. That's a rationalization for your inability to deal responsibly with your feelings as a human being.
Yep.
That's what that is. And the messiness of life. Because when people get the feeling it's messy. It's messy, I'll tell you it's messy. All right. So there is a sense in which this notion of the detached, God is rational, lawgiver. We see it reflected in nature. We see it reflected in the Ten Commandments. You see this going on down in the South now. With this idea that somehow the Ten Commandments is God's primary revelation. You know what it is? I'll tell you what it is. It's the obsession of some mixed up closet anti-Semites who want to replace the Jews within a biblically framed understanding of what it means to be chosen and privileged. That's what's going on. I hope you wrote this down.
I tried.
I can't.
Mixed up closet anti-Semites.
Some closet anti-Semites. It's going to be different. Who are preoccupied with replacing closet anti-Semite white supremacists who want to replace the Jews as God's chosen.
Okay.
Because it affirms their supremacy. The way I said it the first time was better.
Well, it's on the tape, so.
Oh, great. This stuff is going to be valuable one day.
Would you die and burning my stuff so nobody else gets to look at it?
Wow.
She joins me in the great conflagration because the world is not worthy.
Hunt you down and burn your stuff so nobody has it.
If they won't publish it while I'm alive, they have no right to derive benefit from it when I'm gone. They've proven themselves unworthy. Alas. Okay. So this is God. So let's look at this book as a philosophical theology. Oh, let me pull up my notes. Nietzsche is accounting for what I think is his understanding of the divine. Oh, Michelle Pfeffer. She is was a beautiful soul. Look her up on that book. I couldn't find that book, but I ordered so many of them that Amazon got a bunch of them, so now it's available for a lot of people. I had to pay $200 for when I got the book.
Not Pfeiffer.
Pfeffer. Pfeffer.
How do you spell Piper?
I think it's
Michelle
P-F-E-R. I want you to read that in particular, Aaron.
What's a book?
It is a great
By her?
Pfeiffer? Or
Yeah. On Nietzsche.
Saying Pfeffer.
What? No, this is
Pfeffer,
I'm
this is
I'm thinking there's an
not-
actress.
No.
Yeah,
No,
yeah, it's
Pfeffer.
an actress, yeah.
Pfeffer.
But he's
No,
not
this
talking
is, he
about
said
Pfeffer.
Pfeffer.
He's not talking about
Did you find it?
Not
Fighting about her.
Pfeiffer, Pfeffer.
No, just look up.
The last
No,
disciple
go
of
to
Dionysius.
Amazon. Go to Amazon and look her up.
Last disciple of Dionysius?
Ah!
Okay.
The disciple of Dionysius. It shouldn't be last.
Okay, hold on.
That's a misprint. But that's it. The disciple of Dionysius. That is the greatest book ever written on Nietzsche.
Okay.
And the greatest exploration of the meaning of Nietzsche's work. I think. Read that.
The last something.
The last.
I don't know. Hold on.
Y'all remember the myth of the thornbird?
No.
About him impaling himself, and then the last song he sings is, yeah.
Only sings once in his life.
Yeah.
And it's one superlative song,
Rose.
and existence is the price.
Rose Pfeffer.
Rose Pfeffer. And existence is the price. That book that she wrote, she died early.
P-F-E-F-F.
But the whole world, I think,
P-F-E-F-F.
was deprived of something in her.
Thank you.
But she wrote this book.
The last disciple.
The last disciple of mine.
Yeah.
I bet she looks nothing like Michelle.
They're
If
not
you're ever
really.
looking for a book that just makes you feel like Nietzsche as a
I don't know
person, there's a
how to
book
spell
called Nietzsche and Turin.
Oh, not
Yeah.
the last disciple.
Some years ago, yeah. It came out a little yellow hawk at first. That's a good book.
It's a nice book.
The Short and Shadow?
Yeah,
I haven't read it.
We just let me know if I should.
Yeah.
All right, but here's the thing. Nietzsche says that the tragic vision emerges out of the confluence of two things, two different tendencies of the divine in Greek culture. But what I like about this is he's saying that cultural artifacts are disclosive. So these notions of God are cultural artifacts. Like Apollo. He says, and then you have the Dionysian as the two main currents that are primarily in opposition to each other. This is a wonderful mythology. God, I love it. They're in opposition to each other until one day, like the double helix, they wrap together and create a new being. The tragic vision. Now you can't look at this chronologically. You have to have an ontological something. There's a notion called ontologically prior, which I think nothingness is ontologically prior to God, but not chronologically prior. Ontologically prior means it's a necessary condition for it, but they exist simultaneously. So chronological simultaneity does not necessarily exclude the possibility of ontological priority. Okay? Ontological priority. Ontological priority. That means something is more necessary or necessary for the other to be. All right, so anyway, you have the Apollonian, which is characterized by the state of dream and fantasy. Oh, I never did. Oh. And then you have the Dionysian, which is characterized by intoxication. The state of orgasmic intoxication is the Dionysian. The characteristic of the Apollonian is the principium individuationis, the principle of individuality. It's really not quite individuality; it's more like individualityism. It's a German translation. What do you want?
More precision. We are German.
What did you say?
Ich bin hübsch.
Oh, you are German?
I am German. I get it.
Oh, yeah, you
Some
do.
precision, please.
I just had a flash vision of you in leather something.
The later both.
I should
Stop there.
just quit.
I might wear it in class one day.
That would be great. That would be
The
great.
brown shirt, you're talking about not wearing the brown shirt, the stormtroopers thing?
No, I wasn't thinking Nazi. I was thinking more German.
The sprinklers.
Big basket. leather.
Bend over.
Oh, no, come on. I know that guy. Ben over. All right. Describe the Apollonian as emerging from the principium individuus, dream illusion state. And then what happens to the Apollonian? Apollonian emerges. In other words, it's the principle of individuality. But it's characterized, the image he uses is, it is the God who sits in his frail bark while the waves are all around him, focused and visionary. But it isn't rational, simply rational. See, this is the danger. You don't want to get, it's not the rational and the irrational get together. It's not that. It's too strictly artistic. The vision is strictly artistic. Now this is key. Because for Nietzsche, life is only justified as an artistic phenomenon. Now I'm saying this because Nietzsche's philosophical theology is fundamentally a theodicy. As in all serious thinking about God, you'll find that all serious thinking about God is theodicy oriented. It has to come to terms with the problem of evil. It's the great coral reef upon which the theologies have been shipwrecked since time immemorial. How do we come up with an explanation for evil in light of this God who is all these other things that we named a moment ago, and all good, and all powerful? How do we account for evil? So the reason I brought that question up right before we broke was because maybe we're asking the wrong question. Maybe we should ask not is there a God, assuming that God is all good, all powerful, as we understand goodness and power, given the fact that they're evil, but saying, given the fact that there's evil, what kind of God does it suggest? Change the question. Change the question, the answers look different. The problem changes. So then we start asking, well, what kind of God does our experience of the world suggest? I think that's what Nietzsche did. And he's saying, well, if we ask it that way, there's some cultural artifacts that gives us some hints to some alternatives. People have conceptualized the divine differently. So he singles out these two individuals, for him, which is the essence of the Greek understanding of divinity. So he's what? Under the influence of Wagner and some other stuff, which I'm going to leave out. I don't want to get into the reductionism, the psychological reductionism, the ambiguities of his relationship with Wagner, his homosexual cathexis, and all that business. We're not doing that. Sticking to the text. Right. If you want to do that, just go read the other stuff. But I'm looking at it as a philosophical thing, right? So what you get is him saying, you get these two principles. In Greek religion, you get the Apollonian, which is the golden-haired visionary of everything in neat proportion. The art of proportion. I mean, there's a point at which there's a certain kind of mathematical precision involved in beauty.
Yeah, golden ratio.
And there's a certain kind of beauty, yes, and there's a certain kind of beauty in symmetry, reflected in mathematical precision. Yeah. So it's art. Right? So you have Apollo, and it's the principium individuationist, right? It's the principle of the individual, of oneness, of singularity, of clarity, of a sort of undisturbed gaze and focus that pure form. He uses the sculptor and pure form as and the sculptor's art as the model of the Apollonian. But not music.
Yeah, that's the other one.
Music is intoxication. So and fantasy for the Apollonian. We dream. Oh, we dream. I mean, it's sort of, for me, I immediately thought about prophets, right? The dream of John's wonderful dream of a different world. I mean, if you think God, what is God? But the dream we dreamt when we laid down from the waking nightmare of real life. I have those fits occasionally. I can't explain. I just spit it out. It's just it's kind of tick. Reminds me of the Munchkins and the Wizard of Oz. All right. So you have this fantasy. And And the dream, the sculpted vision of a world or of an image form. Yeah, I mean you get this in the Bible. Some it's when people start, and it's always, and I think there's a relationship to this. I'll explain it as we go. But there's a relationship in the Bible where you always get people who are in deep pain. Those are the prophets. They envision these clear alternative worlds where the wicked cease from troubling, the weary is at rest, and land flowing with milk and honey, and rivers, the streams whereof make glad the city of God. You can go to a tree and eat fruit that heals your body. And people live forever and there's no more hunger, no more pain. What a beautiful, sculpted vision of an alternative form of life that would resolve all our deepest difficulties. But then there's the Dionysian, the turbulent, raucous, orgiastic intoxication. Its model is intoxication, and the art form is music. For the Apollonian, its model is sculpture. It's art form, and the state being his dream. And its art form is sculpture. State of mind is dream, or state of being is dream, fantasy. The art form expresses the sculpture for the Dionysian. Its intoxication is art form and music. But also, and more importantly, or as importantly, the dissolution of the principium individuationis in the Dionysian, means the opposite. That means the sense of individual oneness and distinction collapses into this orgiastic flow of passion and power. Oh, yeah. And you do hear Bob in the background, don't you? I do.
You see it really clearly in Job.
Which one?
This the whirlwind, God saying, "Who are you? What are you?" That's just this total
chaos. And the chaos has a voice. And you know what the voice of the chaos is? Music. Because in that, see, Nietzsche argues, in that, the primordial contradiction of the universe is expressed. So he's making metaphysical claims. This atheist is making these metaphysical claims that characterize ultimate reality as at its core contradictory and rife with pain. Now, why is that important? It's important because the rife pain expressed in music and the expressiveness of it thrusts itself up from reality and intersects with the Apollonian vision and with the Apollonian form, and tragedy, or the tragic, emerges. Now, the reason I say it's got to be ontologically prior is because I don't think it's just in the Greeks. I think the first place you see this is in the mythology of the Egyptians. In the Isis, Horus, Osiris myth, I think tragic vision precedes tragedy as a genre. So the Greeks did not give birth to it. They gave birth to the expression of it in a particular genre, the form of tragedy. Which is, brilliant enough. It's genius. But for me, it made sense that the tragic vision as such emerged on the continent of Africa, where life emerged. And it is, for me, the core of life. I think they're onto something. But anyway, I want to do that. So the tragic consists of the intersection, not quite integration, because they remain distinct, the dynamic merger of Apollonian and Dionysian art forms. Now, behind this is his understanding of music and Wagner and so forth, true. But I think it gave him a lens that allowed him to see some deep, and he suggests that he's going a lot deeper because he makes certain ontological claims. So it's not just historical for Nietzsche, it's also ontological. He's talking about ultimate reality. The Dionysian is associated with potency, with nature, spring. Everything subjective or individual collapses into forgetfulness. Now, I think there's a wonderful, wonderful parallel to what happens in black religion. And I think that Nietzsche's talking, he's looking at an analysis of these extremes, of what happens to people at extremes. That's what he's looking at. That's what, remember, tragedy is always already an expression of people as extremes. As a matter of fact, if you don't present people at their extremes, you don't get the tragedy. Now, I think when he talks about the dissolution of the Dionysian into this communal awareness, that's what you see in the black church in worship, particularly when you get to the frenzy. Loss of any sense of individuality. In the traditional understanding of black worship, you saw pure chaos. What would look like pure chaos to people outside of it, I grew up in it. For me, it was pure amusement. That was a bad look. We should sit about it. We should wait to see what get happy next. I didn't know. We didn't know. I was just doing what those bad big kids doing. They're evil. Big kids are evil in church. But whoever's in the big kid category, watch them. They're bad. They're bad eggs. But anyway, so I was just watching them. So they laughed. I thought it was supposed to be funny. But they were wrong. They were so wrong. But for what they taught us. You know, I'm going to bring this up. One or two of them, I remember, one or two of them have become my Facebook friends. And this is lately, and it's not been since I was 9 or 10 that that I remember. I'm going to bring it up. Those are bad examples. But I realized that what was dissolving, the principium individuationis, when black people individualize, that means you individualize how? By strict definition. Which brings what? That cultural taxonomy to the fore. Sharpens your sense of the pain and the contradiction. However, in worship, when you dissolve into this warm, fiery, communal reality, you get to lose all of those distinctions and the cultural taxonomy, and suddenly the affirmation of life is free to express itself, and you got to shout. And Nietzsche has a book that almost sounds just like it, right at the beginning of the book in the first section. So I said, I know they'll read the first section, because the whole book is really an unfolding of the first section. Listen to this. Oh. I don't want another one.
Wow.
I have several copies, but this one's my favorite. The other copy looks like this too, by the way. But this one's my favorite. All right, listen to this. There are some who, from obtuseness, think about traditional, learned ministry, upper class, ontologically prior to evangelical Presbyterians. And traditional Black Baptists, when you listen to this. There are some who, from obtuseness or lack of experience, turn away from such phenomena as folk diseases. With contempt or pity born of the consciousness of their own healthy-mindedness. But of course, such poor wretches have no idea how corpse-like and ghostly their so-called healthy-mindedness looks when the glowing life of the Dionysian revelers roars past them. Just chew on that for a minute. Because that's certainly what we felt about certain church forms of experience. Look at them fools. You know, the assumption is that people feel inferior, but they don't. Even the other high Baptists, we look at them as caricatures of themselves. Look at them. They don't even know who they are. They don't folks sitting up in church acting like that. So, close the door, cut on the lights, hit it, boom. We have church. It's different. Because we don't feel the Spirit is showing up. The Holy Ghost. God haunting religion. Anyway. All right, now there's several things that I want to go over. There's several sections that I think are really important. And this class, by the way, is cumulative. So as you begin to understand Nietzsche, make sure you read it, because this is all going to be relevant, particularly when we go into the heart of the class and then start pulling out theologically. What's next week?
Crucify God.
Oh, I should have waited on that. I was hoping I hadn't made that mistake. I should have waited, but this is important. Now, the Dionysius is the crucified one. So there's a very strong, in other words, you don't get the tragic without the Dionysius. Dionysius was the crucified God. He was that the crucified God is a term taken from Dionysius, which is why Moulton shows up next week. Tragedy, as a genre, was associated with the festival of celebration for the resurrection of Dionysius, which happened when?
Probably Easter.
In the spring. And I'll have you to know that Jesus came from an area in northern Galilee where there was a Dionysian cult still active when he grew up.
Wow.
The most active one was active there, in that area. And if you read this like you were supposed to, you should have seen some striking parallels to Jesus and Nietzsche's description of Dionysus. And then there are equally striking parallels between Jesus and the Apollonian, the golden-haired Apollo whose undisturbed gaze remains securely fixed on its object of adoration, even in the midst of storm and threatening waves. I mean, not to mention the obvious walk on water deal, but y'all get the point. That when you begin to look at this image of Jesus, you begin to get this merger of this "come, let us run to the mountains of Lebanon and greet the snows of spring" image, and "I must needs go to Jerusalem" image. It's not incidental, not historically, not philosophically, not theologically. Accordingly, we recognize in tragedy a sweeping opposition of styles. The language, color, mobility, and dynamics of speech fall apart into the Dionysian lyrics of the chorus, and on the other hand, the Apollonian dream world, and become two utterly different spheres of expression. The Apollonian appearances in which Dionysus objectifies himself are no longer an eternal sea, changeful strife, a glowing life. Like the music of the chorus, no longer those forces merely felt and not condensed into images in which the enraptured servant of Dionysius senses the nearness of the god. Now the clarity and firmness of epic form addresses him from the scene. Now Dionysius no longer speaks through forces, but also as an epic hero, almost in the language of Homer. There is something very close to Jesus and this epic nature of his heroic, titanic struggle in the cross, and at the same time, his fixed sense of serenity. that gets on, on both ends. You get this agony in the garden, and of course on the cross, but you have this overarching sense of undisturbed focus and determination. It is, and there are books written on the tragic. In fact, John was written as a tragedy. I know Mark was. And the fact that the tragic spirit is preserved when Jesus says, I'll drink no wine until I drink it new with you in the kingdom of heaven. In other words, I will take no joy until the whole thing is done. And I'm looking for a specific quote that I want to read to you. Of course, I got all the important stuff underlined. That's part of
It was like the whole book.
Yeah, that's why I have a. So I'm looking for my one little quote on primordial contradiction. But I don't want to give you all too much stuff because some of you didn't read it. I don't want to tell you, what you can just read to get around everything. Because this is filled with so many different insights.
So there's one about music standing in symbolic relation to the primordial contradiction?
Yeah, that's it. What page?
I have a different page number, but
That's why I said use this edition. Okay, which one is it?
it's probably...
What section? Just tell me what
4.
section.
9.
I'll just read it from here.
It's 9 or 11. Oh, there it is. Oh, there it is.
Oh, good.
It's 11.
The end of 6.
No, it tells you what section.
The end of 6.
Oh, it is. Then we're going to come back to 11. Turn to section 6, you all.
Unless you mean the one in 9. There's 2 different ones.
Well, he said it several times.
55 on the bottom. I don't know if that's the one you're looking for.
Language can never adequately render the cosmic symbolism of music because music stands in symbolic relation to the primordial contradiction and primordial pain in the heart of the primal unity, and therefore symbolizes a sphere which is beyond and prior to all phenomena. Rather, all phenomena compared with it are merely symbols. All right, that's an example of him making a metaphysical claim about the nature of ultimate reality, at the heart of which is pain, which is, in other words, this is a significant move when he says, of which all reality are symbols. Now, for me, theologically, is where the disclosive power of Jesus comes in as key to understanding ultimate reality. His crucifixion, pain, are all symbols of the primordial contradiction and pain at the heart of the primal unity. So that the tragic becomes disclosive of God.
Do you think that's what Nietzsche meant when he said the last Christian died on the cross?
I think he meant something far more cynical than that, but what do you think, Eric?
Well, one thing I read and I noticed is that I sometimes when he makes these broad statements like that, I want to turn them around because he says like all phenomena compared with, he says, hence language as the organ and symbol of phenomena can never by any means disclose the innermost heart of music. And I want to turn that around and say, yet music can never disclose the heart of language or an idea. I mean, there's the concept of the word. In the beginning was the word.
Yes, but he wants to say that, yes.
So I'm saying, but that's not discounting anything he says, because one of the main points that he's over and over again saying is his ambiguity, that there is, you have to accept the fact that there's always the contradiction. Nothing is settled. So music might be this and provide something, and yet it's not sufficient. Language does its part, and it's not sufficient. Neither. You can't rest easy in either place. You're constantly forced off balance.
Yes, I think that's accurate. And I think he writes like that because of that.
Right, absolutely. No, so I think
well, in fact, he argued that in some places, that this is the nature of life.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the characteristics of the existentialist, right, is that the existentialists recognize that life is contradicting.
He also says there's a realm of truth and being, but reason is excluded from it. That's from a different.
Right. But of course, Nietzsche, on the other hand, I mean, he talks about, right, let me see where this is. He talks about in this book, that the logic recoils like a snake and bites its own tail. That's one quote you're going to find. And that's where you get this notion that every reason has this quantum of logic, and every emotion has this quantum of reason, and every reason has this quantum of emotion. That the two cannot anyway be separated. Certainly, I mean, Nietzsche is definitely doing something like that when he sees the rationality of form not being rationality itself. It's still artistic, but go ahead.
There's one other quote he has that I thought was great too. This is a different book, but he says, "Truth is a temptation, one that must and cannot be resisted." I mean, that's again that inherent ambiguity in life, that nothing is ever as it seems. You can't finally say, "I've got it."
Right. Right. But because you never can quite have it all.
Right.
And truth is defined, as he's talking about it, is as absolute. And so
He calls it a truth, a moving army of metaphors.
Because it's always already being disclosed.
Right. Yeah. Truths are illusions whose illusionary nature has been forgotten. Metaphors have been used up and lost their imprint, and now operate as mere metal, no longer as coins. Good stuff.
Yep, excellent stuff. I want you to look at this quote on 37 again for this kind of reason. Here we have to explore what kind of God corresponds to these states, and therefore what is the operational theological vision of God that informs and corresponds to these religious experiences. So if you have, on the other hand, the Dionysian that goes roaring by, and then this ghost-like, insipid, lifeless pallor, on the other hand, have to ask ourselves, what kind of God corresponds to those states? Because you're talking about a different religious experience, to some extent, must reflect the God to which it is connected. Or at least an implicit understanding of God. So on the one hand, with this tasteless, insipid, colorless religion, you have a God of no passion. Clearly, it's not the biblical God. Gets angry, throws temper tantrums, destroys whole worlds. There's a lot of stuff. Clearly, it's not the same God. But the God of the Dionysian crowd must be a different kind of God, a God of rich expressions of joy, passion, and sorrow. And remember, the tragic is a combination of joy and magisterial sorrow, blended together into a whole, into a vision, blended together into a vision of life. All right, so let's ask ourselves, what these conceptions of God, because religious experience is what? One source of our reflection about God. So if we're looking at different forms of religious experience for what they suggest to us about God, certainly, I'm a sly Markian in this sense, I believe that Christian theology must to some extent be an articulation of the consciousness of the church. I believe it. Let's start there. It's got to be.
Must reflect the constitution of the church?
Consciousness.
Consciousness, sorry.
I think this is 11th or 12th thesis in the dogmatics. Christian theology is consciousness of the church. Slamarkian in that sense. Articulate the consciousness of the church. That's what theology does.
Yep.
Now, it does not rationalize or reflect the status quo, the consciousness of the church. Now, you have a question: to what extent is that normative or phenomenological? I think for me, it's phenomenological. with a normative moment, because you got to know what's toxic and what isn't. I think the church is ambiguous. The consciousness is not pure in form of any kind. But I think that we can distill elements. And I think when I articulate the consciousness of a black church, I do not get liberation. I get tragedy. I don't see this shit cone saw. It ain't there. You get, you know what I mean? It's not there. I mean, you have elements, of course, of resistance. But I'm not getting, I don't see that.
So you're not a liberation theologian because...
Well, I mean, I might be a liberation theologian, but I'm not making that claim that that's what the black church is, a liberating institution.
Okay.
I'm saying if you're doing liberation theology, you're doing normative theology. You're saying that this is what Scripture tells you the church should be. I'm cool with that. If that's what you're doing. I might be doing that once in a while. But when I'm doing theology in the African American key, in other words, theology is reflecting the consciousness of the church as a manifestation of God's presence through immanence or the Holy Spirit, however you have it, that I see something else. I see a whole hell of a lot more going on there than protest signs. I ain't writing everybody's protest theology. That's not what I see. That's an allusion to James Baldwin's Everybody's Protest novel. His reaction to Langston Hughes and others. I'm not writing, he said, I'm not writing everybody's protest novel. I'm not writing everybody's protest theology. Sorry, that's not what I do. I'm interested in God, which who may or may not be interested in me at any given moment. Just, it might turn out that it might turn out that I don't get.
Isn't it we need God more than God needs us?
Well, I mean, you can get in that language. That's not quite what I'm saying.
Okay.
I'm saying the whole concept of the way you just used it may not even be applicable.
Yeah.
But we got to think about it and explore it.
Okay.
All right? Nietzsche's saying that there are two fundamental currents in life, the Apollonian and the Dionysian, ultimately, that manifests itself in the tragic God. That's what I think he's saying. He's saying that the divine reality is a tragic one. And it is most deeply disclosed through art. Not only that, he says art is the only justification for life. And that, yes, and that ultimately God is revealed as the universal artist, he says clearly, and that art is a mode of revelation for God, and the most exclusive form is tragedy. That's Nietzsche's claim. I just think it's the tragic, and I don't think you need to set it up that way, but I do. I think ultimately that see, and remember he talks about this consolation. It's almost too much to go through quote by quote and read. But remember he talks about music serving as the main form of consolation.
Yes.
You can see that nowhere is that as clear as it is in the black church, where it is accused of being conservative by liberation theologians who misunderstand the nature of the experience they purport to explain to the world. Yeah, they're wrong, I'm right. Those of you that read my book, reading this should really help some of that get much clearer. Tragedy absorbs the, well, let me go up a little higher. If this is in section 21. Second full paragraph. toward the middle. But let us ask by means of what remedy it was possible for the Greeks during the Great Period, in spite of the extraordinary strength of their Dionysian and political instincts, not to exhaust themselves either in aesthetic brooding or in a consuming chase after worldly power and worldly honor, but rather to attain that splendid mixture which resembles a noble wine in making one feel fiery and contemplative at the same time. Here we must clearly think of the tremendous power and stimulated, purified, and discharged the whole of life, the whole of the people, tragedy. We cannot begin to sense its highest value until it confronts us, as it did the Greeks, as the quintessence of all prophylactic powers of healing, as the mediator that worked amongst the strongest and in themselves most fatal qualities of the people. Tragedy absorbs the highest ecstasies of music, so that it truly brings music, both among the Greeks and among us, to its perfection. But then it places the tragic myth and the tragic hero next to it, and he, like a powerful titan, takes the whole Dionysian world upon his back and thus relieves us of this burden. That's Jesus in the midst of the powerful musical tradition you see in African American religion. The whole Dionysian movement finds expression in this figure. And it's the symbolic and mythological overplus that allows Jesus to function that way, while at the same time disclosing the primordial contradiction at the heart of the universe and justifying our suffering through participation in it. And this is important because I think theologically, what?
That's okay. Keep going.
No.
No, I'm just saying, sometimes you talk so fast I can't get it, but that's why I have this, so I can go back and listen.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, you got that. What's the word? Then you got, what was that? So this is why Mokman is so important next week and the following. Because you begin to be, I want you to begin to, at least at the beginning of the course, before we move into some of the higher, more philosophical framing of this, of the idea of the divine, in light of challenges from almost every sector, or contributions, science, particularly the problem of suffering. When I say the problem of evil, I don't mean the problem of why people don't do what God say do. I'm not interested. It's the problem of suffering that concerns me. Okay. But I want you to have this framing of how this relationship between Christ's figure, Christ's mythology, Christ as disclosive subject, Christ as suffering hero, has to a ontological conception of the universe and God. And there's a continuity in these images. Because you have people who would have you think that somehow Christian religion is everything else is to be legitimate somehow, and our religion is contrived. We always apologize. I always got to apologize for. No, it's horse shit. No, there's something about Christianity that discloses something ontological about the nature of reality, and any suffering people can see it. It doesn't not make sense that people who suffer should embrace the religion of Christianity because the oppressor saw something in it too. He's human, ain't he? No, but it makes perfect sense. Or you ask yourself a different way. Why do people who consistently suffer always seem to gravitate toward that? Because it's disclosive of something. Something we intuit is there. Something like Melville's Mass drawing near to us. No, I didn't get through it without a reference. I was alluding to it when I talked about God drawing near in the pain.
Yeah. I'm trying to figure out phrases. What the hell? Nietzsche setting up this, talking about this Apollonian.
Apollonian.
Thank you. And Dionysian, and this heart of life, this primal thing is about suffering. I don't want to dichotomize something or hide something, but also something. Underneath suffering, to me, when I think about God, is the reality of death. Suffering is something that occurs in life. Death ceases that. And yet death ultimately still stays to be that point of conflict. I mean, that's the longing. Life doesn't continue. So all these things that occur within this life are problematic because there's no second chance. There's no continuing. And I'm not really sure where I'm going with that, but I wonder if something with what he's talking about, I think he's spot on, but I can't quite articulate. It's almost as if he's talking about these two forms, and they themselves, in a sense, distract us from the reality of death too.
No, not at all. Death is a part of the suffering, right?
Right.
All right. And the fact that we have to die is part of our living nightmare, which threatens life with a certain level of meaninglessness. Because there's no do-over, and not a do-over, there's not any ultimate meaning to it. But Nietzsche argues the tragic vision turns that potential despair or horror into art.
Yes, absolutely.
And at that point, it becomes bearable. And my point is, at that point, we see the divine. And that's redemption.
And that's exactly where I was going. Absolutely, right.
Yeah. That's how it crystallizes. That's redemption. When something, we're in over our head.
Mm-hmm.
But the experience of beauty reclaims a net value.
Mm-hmm.
Because the whole notion of redemption emerges out of theory of death.
And that goes back to what you said, is when you consider what is your notion of God? What question are you trying to answer?
Yes. And ultimately, that's it. The question of life and its meaning in the face of its fundamental parameters, our extremities. Limit tos and limit of. Limit to life, death, disease, or limits of life, death, disease, and so forth, mortality, subject to time, and the limit twos, I think, are maybe mixed up. David Tracy talks about a restoration of order, when we get despair and so forth, and longing and all these other. These are the basic parameters in which we operate. Those are our limits, or our extremities. That's what I mean when I say extremities.
Mm-hmm.
What does life mean in light of that?
Yeah.
Why didn't he use Jesus? Because he was associating all of the impassibleness of God with Jesus. I mean, if he's such a good figure to use, then why didn't Nietzsche just use tragedy and use Jesus?
I don't, because he wasn't doing Christian theology. He was doing theory of the tragic. But I think he had Jesus. I can't prove it. But Jesus is Dionysius for Nietzsche. I mean, at other points, all right? He just don't think Christians are.
Doesn't he discuss that in the Antichrist?
That's what I was thinking, yeah, in the Antichrist.
Good book to pick up.
No, yeah, there's a good, Walter Kaufman has a good article on the Antichrist in his essays. I think it's an edited volume that he did with a bunch of scholars on Jesus. I don't have access to my books. They're all boxed up in my garage. I got to use Amazon, so my what do you call it, card catalog. I'll look it up. Look up Walter Kaufman on Nietzsche. It should come out. I wanna. Here the question of the theological differences implicit in tradition makes itself felt, raises the question we talked about earlier of the task of theology when it takes religious experience seriously as a source of reflection. Is a kind of reverse critical realism. The question becomes, why trust one experience more than another? This brings into focus the importance of other sources for theological reflection, including the use of reason and other cognitive frameworks. I covered that. Mid-page on 37, I want to relate. I assumed I could use the first section as unpacking that for the whole book. But let's look at mid-page, the ecstatic vision. I want you to see the ecstatic vision. when he's describing the Dionysius and the dissolution of the individual principium, he says, now the slave is a free man. Now all the rigid, hostile barriers that necessity, caprice, or impudent convention have fixed between man and man are broken. Now with the gospel of universal harmony, each one feels himself not only united, reconciled, and fused with his neighbor, but as one with him, as if the veil of Maya had been torn aside, and were now merely fluttering in tatters before the mysterious primordial unity. So you see the vision of aesthetic redemption. You know, you reminded me of that when you brought up Jesus. You see this vision of redemption is still operative in Nietzsche's thinking. He's doing theology here. But he's talking about a critical realist redemption. A redemption that actually transpires within a certain immanent frame. Which is why I talk about it transpiring in the black liturgy. I mean, it's not, you don't want to reduce it to therapeutic work, like it's some psychological experience and fall victim to tribal therapeutic. It is theological in meaning, and it may very well be, I think, it's divine in its origin. But what you get is God operating within a liturgical framework to redeem the value of people for them, redeem the value for them, redeeming them for them. God for us. As God restores the value to life and restores the value to humans that are consistently degraded by these taxonomies that vanishes in the hyperliminal state of the frenzy induced by Dionysian intoxication of worship. That's not the only form. It just happens to be a form that evolved within the framework of the Christian culture with a group of people forced to live on their extremes. Not just having come to an extreme, but forced to live, to settle there. So it generated a particular tragic tradition. And that's the brilliance. That's why everybody who wants to sing sounds like, across the world in popular culture, they don't sound like blacks in the diaspora. They don't sound like black. No, they all sound like us. African Americans, because something developed unique on these shores for a variety of reasons, having to do with the nature of slavery, the nature of being stripped, being forced to the furthest extremity, and still accessing a certain kind of divinely grounded creativity out of which this thing emerged. And Christianity became the visionary focus of the Apollonian for the Dionysian expression of pain, sorrow, and triumphal joy all at the same time. And it expressed itself through the eye of the Christian faith, and you got this tradition. That's what happened. That's where it happened. I can see it. Okay, but it's good to look at to help us study this other stuff. Because all these philosophers, including Whitehead, some of the most abstract mathematical philosophers of all you will see, come down on the idea that God is fundamentally tragic. And that God's power in the context of this tragic reality is closely associated, if not defined, by beauty. For Whitehead, it becomes God's power. So that the tragic expression becomes at once both the revelation and the exercise of God's power. So that the revelation of God itself is the manifestation of God's power. So God is revealed through beauty, at the same time exercises himself through beauty. So revelation and manifestation and power are all the same. It's just Godness. The divine is what I prefer to call it. Now this is very different from this monarchical conception of a God who sits up there with a scepter and whacks people over the head when they do bad. Throws candy when you do good. Just throws over the candy. Go there, run, pick it up quickly now, get your reward. That kind of stuff. the least funny God. Or cosmic bellhop going around carrying your baggage for you. Yeah, all kind of images. We can have fun with that. But you have this tragic vision of God who manifests himself. And you know what? Here's the thing, right? As painful as it may be, that may ultimately be the exercise of divinity allowable in a world where freedom is exercised by something other than God. See, it's our freedom that makes us vulnerable to the tragic. It also makes God vulnerable. These notions of God have some things. In other words, all these concepts that Nietzsche is trying to come to terms with some stuff, with a lot of stuff. Trying to create a conception of ultimate reality that embraces our existential extremes. What we know through experience about life that is a contradiction of any of these assumptions about goodness or balance in terms of life being an exchange of good for good and evil for evil, any of those assumptions, or God's power in relation to goodness. The fact of the matter is that under the traditional conception of time, it's impossible to make sense out of a God that's both good and all-powerful, unless you simply resort to the, ignorance as an argument. We just don't know. Well, we don't know, but that isn't an explanation. And it's not satisfactory. It doesn't, I'm sorry. It just doesn't make sense. There is a mystery that's a sensible mystery. But that God is all good and God is all powerful, it's just nonsense. That's not mystery, it's just nonsensical. If we understand power to mean God can do anything God wants to do. That, to me, that's a senseless statement. What the hell does that even mean? God can do whatever God can do anything. Yeah, he can't make a rock too large for himself in the front. What does that mean? If he can't lift it up, then he can't do anything. If he can't make it, he can't do anything. So I mean, some assertions just don't make sense under certain conditions.
Yeah, so then you're getting back to Rabbi Kushner's book, Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People?
We are way before him.
Yes, I know
We're
that.
leading up to him.
Yeah, but his, the way he answers the question is that God is not all powerful.
Well, ultimately, that's where most people come down. And Rabbi Kushner is relying on some of the people that you're going to learn. He's just not discussing, but people like Edgar Sheffield Brightman, Gordon Parker Bound, Peter Bertacci, Alfred North Whitehead, and Charles Hartshorne, this guy Bajaya, all kinds of people who you say that God's not all powerful. But let me suggest this to you: that God can be perfectly all powerful in the sense that he may have all the power that there is, but power itself can be limited. Why should power, what kind of monster would God be if power was co-eternal with God? And what kind of monster would we have to be to require a God for whom power is eternal? What kind of being is that really? It's a monstrosity. Now, there is the expression of his being is power. But power don't have to be what the hell we think it is. Like the ability to do anything at any time. Why must power be that? So you can talk about what the quantity of power is, what the nature of power is, all of which is up for grabs. After a while, you have to start asking yourself, to what extent does this, Bajaya points out that it's a monstrosity. He's one of many people who pointed out. But after a while, you have to begin to ask yourself, to what extent are these theological conceptions reflections of something monstrous about the people who come up with them? After a while, and you know, that's it.
Yeah.
And of course, they're telling you not to think that,
Right.
which makes me even more suspicious. What don't you want me to see? But it's certainly contrary to what Jesus said power was. I mean, Jesus' whole argument goes against everything we're taught after him to believe about the nature of God's power. That's arbitrary, monarchical, worldly, has to do with manipulation of finite objects to unreasonable, limitless ends. I mean, come on, man. That's self-contradictory. That you can do infinite things with finite stuff? That's all powerful? Really? It's senseless. God could be the nature such that God's power is this. It's beauty. It's imagination. Now, that may not do much for you if you're depressed and want to get free. But of course, according to Rubenstein, he don't do nothing for you, no. Right? That's what we get last week. I mean, so but what we do, what we know is, for instance, what we know is black people still fighting for liberation. We just came through the King holidays where we were celebrating having started something we never finished.
Right.
Yeah.
To the point of absurdity.
Yeah.
Ad nauseum. All right? But what we have had access and reference to historically. The beauty. When manufactured meaning out of beauty. Now, what does meaning have to do? Did meaning have to do with a cognitive justification of existence? No. Because a cognitive justification of existence aims at one thing. Restoration of value or preservation of value by providing an explanation for those things that will contradict the value of life. Whereas art skips all of that, and it is direct infusing of value in life through beauty. That's all explanations are designed to do. Explanations don't do anything but stick value back in life by removing the presence of what contradicts value. So art strengthens value by making life what? Worthwhile. It restores value in the experience of life, and the moment that you encounter beauty, all of a sudden it's the experience, direct experience of value. And it says life is worthwhile. Still. And in spite of. Now, as far as I'm concerned, there is no greater power than that. Because that is the power that undergirds and is a necessary precondition for the preservation of what? Possibility. If I lose hope, now we're talking about hope here. We're not talking about optimism. We're talking about hope that says life is worth preserving. In other words, the hope that says, I will get out of the bed today and not take my life. I'm talking about that basic affirmation of value. I'm not talking about optimism. Oh, maybe things will work out. Hell, maybe they won't. But whether it does or does not, I go on because life is valuable, and it might. Okay, it might. But I stay alive in the mightness. What makes me stay alive in the mightness is that life still has value. So in other words, the necessary precondition for success, of course, is the preservation of the condition of possibility, which means existence. It means existence. It means survival. And survival means you got to hold on to some value. Life has to have some value. There's something about beauty that's salvific because it keeps you in the game in case something good happens. And that is a power worthy of a divinity. The nature of divinity is to secure the necessary preconditions for creation and life. And to sustain those conditions so that life goes on as possible. And sustain preconditions, necessary preconditions of possibility allows for life to go on. Just a big idea. So one thing that our big idea about God has got to do is establish parameters. And that, quite frankly, may be big enough. And if it ain't big enough for you, what you gonna do about it? I don't know. All right. Next week we got Sir Mutman, von Mutman.
Another German?
Ha! I'm kind of stuck on these Germans, aren't I?
Is he a dead man?
He's a dead German.
He's a dead German.
Doesn't this class go like 4:30?
But we went from. Oh, it ends at 4:30?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I was giving my summation.
That's okay. That's okay.
Oh no! By all means, I'm glad you told me.
She's special.
Thank you. Thank you, my little diva. Thank you.
We can. Sorry.
No, let's take a quick 5-minute stretch break, and then let's go open for questions. Let's do questions for the next half hour. So hold it, so everybody get the benefit of it. I want questions too. I want some questions about his conceptualizations, because some of his reasons kind of nuanced, but he does it in aphorisms. But Eric, these are some of his longest aphorisms. They're more like chapters, really. So it's not. He hasn't gotten to where he is in some of his other stuff. I don't think right here. But he's really thinking about God. He's really thinking about the divine.
I don't know for sure, but I wonder sometimes if the reason he didn't write about Jesus is because the second you do that, you box your idea into a preconceived thing that his readers would have right away not listened any further and go, whereas by doing the I can't pronounce it.
Apollonian Dionysian.
Thank you. I don't think he consciously did that, but was the brilliance is not to do so because it kept his thoughts open-ended.
He might have been consciously not using Jesus but the obvious parallels are here.
But rather than actually saying the word Jesus,
right,
people would have immediately cut off and stopped thinking.
I think you're right. If you look at the tragedy, what's his name? Pericles keeps popping. It's not Pericles. It's
Prometheus?
No. The tragedian.
Aeschylus?
Sophocles?
Not Aeschylus, not Sophocles.
Euripides. He says Euripides broke everything apart.
Yes. But he said Euripides was a triumph of the rationalistic spirit.
Yeah.
But Euripides, not quite, there's that element. If you read it, it certainly isn't the deep pathos of Aeschylus, nor the clear, tragic distillation of the pathos in Sophocles. You do get more rationalistic orientation and framework of dialogue. But in the imagery and the story, you still see what Nietzsche's getting, because he is talking about Dionysius, right? The Bacchae. And in the Bacchae, he talks specifically about a couple of things that should sound awfully familiar. He becomes the god of bread and wine. Dionysius is the god of bread and wine, who leads people to a wondrous land of milk and honey. But it turns into sheer terror. I remember Tracy talking about sheer, he kept saying sheer terror, and it stuck with me. I heard a lecture on it when I was at the University of Chicago. He was teaching with, what is it, Green? Andrew Green or somebody. Greeley. Andrew Greeley, his friend. And I think Greeley passed, didn't he?
Greeley's passed.
Yeah, he and Tracy were good friends during that period. They taught together on the
They were both in Chicago.
Yeah, and so was there with him. And I was studying Greek tragedy. Part of the reason Tracy was reading it then to talk to Andrew really because he was reading some of it along with me for my dissertation. So we were rereading it. And we were reading Greek tragedians and now I'm thinking Fanon, but it's not Fanon. We were reading Greek tragedy and we were reading Lacan at the time, and somebody else. But he kept talking about the sheer terror. I wasn't even in the class. I was just sitting in it. I might have been through coursework. The sheer terror in Euripides when Dionysius turns. So you get the Redeemer and then the God of judgment. In Dionysius you get this joy and then the sheer terror, which is different from sorrow. And so one of the things Tracy was pointing out is that when Dionysius, with Euripides, Bacchae, you begin to get the development of this notion of terror versus joy and sorrow, which is where I love. But you get this notion of terror. And there is, I think, I never forgot it because it bothered me. I think there's something about the nature of the tragic that it requires a delicate spiritual balance, because it's sort of like moonshine. If it ain't made right, it becomes poison. And there's something in the tragic vision that you have to be careful of because it can turn to terror. It's a delicate, and I don't know what the element is that preserves the balance. But once you start operating beyond the concept of good and evil, then the danger to rationalize evil as tragic necessity, like, say, Hitler's murder of the Jews, Gypsies, and Russians because the Germans need living space. Yeah. If they really need the living space, somebody got to go. So they can easily say we're not guilty. What we're doing is tragic, but it has to be done. That kind of rationale sounds very reasonable to governments that can do some heinous things. But the potential for that kind of argument is implicit in the tragic conception. So there is a sense in which the tragic can revert back. Let me give you a better example. Since we're talking about the god of wine, Dionysius, let's talk about wine and vinegar. There's a point at which the sweetness of the tragic wine can turn to the vinegar of terror and justification. Like my example here. I'm not killing you because I hate you. I'm killing you because I love you. But I love others, and I got to make a tragic choice. There's a tendency, there is a potential in the tragic to turn to terror. And I think Euripides was right in saying that. But it's something that Aeschylus and Sophocles did not see. But something characteristic, particularly of our age, and is a peculiar danger implicit in our own era.
So then you're suggesting that there's something that keeps a tragic vision from veering toward the psychopathic versus the life.
Yes. Yes.
So is it?
It's something in there. It's some chemical in the mix.
Would that be?
It's a preservative.
Would that be love?
Yeah.
Or some some way of understanding love?
I think maybe.
Or empathy.
And, yeah, compassion.
Or, for me, in my book, I argue it's the beauty. It's beauty.
Right.
The beauty that it flees from terror. For me, the horror is what happens when the horror becomes terror when it's untransformed by beauty. Of course, you can make a lot of things beautiful. So, I mean, maybe we still need some other element.
Because beauty is so subjective, right? Or is it?
It's so bewitching. Not just subjective, it's bewitching.
So why did Nietzsche dislike Euripides so much?
Because he was rationalistic. I'm saying that he was right and rationalistic, but I'm also saying that Nietzsche did not see something that I'm arguing I'm seeing.
I see, yeah.
There's because of the whole notion, my whole argument in terms of how I frame it is that what makes tragic, gives it its depth and power, is its look into the abyss.
Mm-hmm.
But it does it in a way that allows you to look at it without experiencing the insanity that emerges when you look at the horror. The thing that Marlowe avoided, that Kurtz looked too long at. That, of course, Melville says to Ishmael not to stare too long at fire, because it didn't be as it did for a time. Than me. But there's something in the experience of life. People who look at the horror of life don't remain the same.
Yeah.
Whether you go to war, wherever you go. My argument is without the transformative power of the tragic, transfiguring power of the transvaluing, transfigurative power of the tragic vision, you're vulnerable to insanity, cruelty, cynicism, despair, suicide.
But isn't that power ambiguous?
As all power is. Yes. Of course it's ambiguous.
So I can imagine, like with your example for Hitler, I mean, Hitler can concoct a victim narrative of Germany after World War I.
Not a victim narrative, it's different from what I'm saying.
Okay.
A tragic justification is different from a victim narrative.
How would you make that distinction?
You have a conflict of goods, so you have to decide one good over another. I'm just giving you the initial simplistic understanding of tragic, which is primarily borrowing Hegel's idea that the tragic is caused not when good and evil conflicts, but rather two goods come into conflict. It's the essential tragic moment. So with Hitler, for instance, the life of two different people, for instance, come into conflict. Neither one of those people deserve to lose out, but one of them has to lose for the other to survive. And so while we don't hate Jews and the Poles, we very sorrowfully recognize the necessity, the tragic necessity, of being done with that. Which is a little different from saying we were victims, therefore we doing this. That's the same thing.
Gotcha.
That's kind of what the Israelis want you to think. As their logic. Everybody should be sympathetic to our excesses because they're necessary for us to protect ourselves from the things that we fear. Y'all should be comfortable with our excesses against other people because you have to accept our paranoia because you are in some way partly responsible for creating it. That's different. The justification for victimization is one thing. Justification for the tragic explanation is saying, hey, we understand that you got just as much right to live as we do. And you have just as much right to fight to live as we do. But it is a fight, and a fight to the finish, by the nature of the case. We don't blame you. We don't hate you. But we will exterminate you. And then we'll have rituals of grieving to help us get over how much pain we felt destroying you. We'll have war memorials, so we no longer feel bad about how much we made you suffer. That's the sick reality of civilization in the Western world. Not only that, they insist that we all jump on the bandwagon and participate. Even us.
So,
Yeah, they insist that we jump, that we participate, and once you have to fight to make something heinous, reveal something heinous, and you haven't even revealed how heinous it was. I can tell you some stories. Some real stories. If you want to know what the nitty gritty of black suffrage was. You know, you're from Texas. But I came from a place in Virginia where they're still 60 years behind time. At least 60. 60 is a conservative estimate. Really 1930s. Lawrenceville, Virginia, shit, Google it. Google it right now. Look at the town. Just look at the town. Lawrenceville, Virginia. Just pull it up on Wikipedia, I dare you. All right, so that bridge is right down the road from my house, my property too. That bridge, Iron Gate Bridge. Mm-hmm.
Population 1,000?
Huh? Mm-hmm. That's the biggest town in the county. That's one of the biggest counties in Virginia land-wise. And it's majority black. Mm-hmm. Ruled by white oligarchs from any known period until now, the same family. We still living directly around the descendants of our owners, of the people who hold our folk. Unbroken, anything. Oh yeah.
Runaway County?
No sorrow,
Hmm?
no sorrow, no acknowledgement. And the white folks,
When I was 17, I was pulling tobacco,
yeah.
and we were on the back of Bobby Taylor, Billy Taylor's truck. My cousin Bowler was on the back of the truck. He had just finished filling up a folk barn, rather than a traditional barn. He was laying on the tailgate. He had a whistle in his mouth. I don't know whose whistle it was. But he kept breathing in through his nose and kind of blowing it like, you know, like people store on cartoons. Billy Taylor said, "Stop blowing that whistle, boy." So he was working on something. How much he had to pay us a guest that day, because our cousin, married to our cousin, Bowleg's, my cousin Bowleg's aunt, Charlie Lee, was his foreman. So Bowleg had to breathe in through his nose. He wasn't paying attention, so he breathed out again through his mouth. And he took his foot, put it on Bowleg's neck, shoved him off the back of the truck, and said, "Boy, didn't I tell you to stop blowing that whistle?" Bowleg jumped up and said, "I ain't gonna be your boy." He said, "You'll be my nigga." That was 1978. I was 16. So that day he said, he put Bowleg off his property, and that day he said, "Who wants their money?" Because you usually wait till the end of the week, or you could get your money if you needed it. Because he had pulled tobacco every day, by then it was August, it was hot, and the tobacco was getting ripe. And they went to speak up, and I looked at my young cousins, and they shut up. I said, "Everybody want their money today." He looked for a minute and said, "Okay." Then he said, "Now who's going back to school?" And he said, "You going back to school?" He wanted me to stay on the farm and help. I was smart. And I laughed at him. I said, "Am I going back to school?" I said, "I'll tell you, I'll let you answer that." We all angry. It didn't mean shit to him that he did that. Now, I quit for everybody quit. When I say everybody's money, that means ain't nobody going back. They didn't go back until I went back to school and wasn't paying no attention to some of my cousins helping some who left us back out in that field, burned a year, lost a lot of money. Because we could fill a bulk barn a day. We could fill a regular barn by 11 o'clock. We could pull it back. We could roll, as we say. So we left his out back out there in that field that year. I had a protest because they were letting us out. When I get back to school, they let the whole school out to go pull tobacco. And when we went to pull tobacco, we had to make up the days on Saturday. And what sense did that make? You know, people that still gonna want us to pull on Saturday. They just got us to let school out. The argument was to justify, the justification was too many students lost time during the week. Well, hell, everybody know we pulled back on Saturday. We pulled back every day when it's right. Anyway, I protested and embarrassed. It was in the Washington Post 60 Minutes call down there. It was the beginning of that thing that Cheryl Sherrod was. I did that at 17, started that with the farmers in Brunswick County, Virginia. Now I bring that up as a prelude to this. I had to ride around with a shotgun on the back seat of my sister's car till I left the town. Soon I got out of bed. Because they were death threats to me. My grandfather was telling me I was constantly going to end up in a ditch. That was 1979. So you ask me, is there any remorse? There ain't even no acknowledgement. It's the same thing. It ain't changed. That's why all this King Day BS is delusional. It's straight delusional. It was just, we just got started on something. And it took so much for black people to stand up to all that terror and fear that they confused the amount of energy and exertion it took to start with having accomplished something. Because for them, standing up was an accomplishment.
Yeah.
White folks saw it and said, okay, we buy that, let's celebrate. And the movement died. That's what happened. I don't care what they tell you, I'm telling you it was real. And it's to all their advantage because all of them benefited. But the middle class been benefited on exploitation of poor and working class black people all along. Nothing new. You notice they did not desegregate in Atlanta, where King was, where the civil rights movement came to die. Why? Because you had developed black middle class there whose power and privileges were predicated on the distinction of the races. Because they couldn't be guaranteed jobs if they allowed white folks to start working in the black community. Where were the black folks going to work? Who was going to be the first one to lose jobs? They knew we were. They wouldn't in no hurry to integrate. Integration meant loss of job, revenue, income for the churches, middle class, everybody. It was separate facilities. The only thing guaranteeing us labor. We were necessary. Once they integrated facilities like that, we weren't necessary anymore. Now we had no reason to be. We became a surplus labor pool. We became a redundant population. And that's where we are. So now they're locking them up. And killing them. Right? Because they're a redundant population. So, you know, things ain't quite what they appear. But alas, let us get back to God. I mean, what hath God to do with these things? I'm speaking in King James. What hath God to do with this?
God doesn't have part of the is not part of the oppression.
Sure he is. He preserves the necessary preconditions for it. The question is, can he preserve the necessary precondition for life without at the same time aiding and abetting oppressors? And the answer is no, therefore it's tragic. That's the point. That God's implicated.
Well, that might be the view of traditional Christianity. Are you saying that's the view of traditional Christianity?
That's my critique of any concept of God, period. Any concept of God, he's implicated. Or she's implicated. Whichever one you want to use, don't make me any difference. Really literally, really doesn't make me any difference. I think both metaphors are disclosive, but at any point, if God preserves the necessary precondition for existence, then he creates the conditions exploited by oppressors to rule over the oppressed. And I don't like to use oppressed and oppressed because it makes it too ethical. Because what it does is it de-emphasizes the pain while it emphasizes the morality. I think that's part of what happens. A lot of things with the problem of God, we emphasize obedience, we de-emphasize laws. Because it's easy, it's easier to deal with people when we judge them rather than feel sorry for them. Because then we become part of the pain. So we rather moralize. So I mean, when we say oppressor, oppressed, you kind of lose sight often of pain. But I think if you even use victim and victimizer, God is still implicated. Because God sustains the necessary preconditions for what they rely on to get the job done. I mean, God sustains the physical laws that govern the path of projectiles. Bullets work because God sustains the laws upon which the flight, the trajectory of the bullet depends. God created that world, that order. God's implicated. See, God ain't innocent. If he is, it's got to be in some tragic sense.
But if God is implicated then in what you're describing as the oppression, a lot of people.
Any people that's oppressed, he's in
For sure. Because he maintains the preconditions.
Right.
Then it seems to place the onus squarely on us to change the situation.
He also preserves, the necessary conditions that allow for the possibility of change. God does that. He makes his sun to rise on the just and the unjust. And there's biblical precedent for this. He makes it rain upon the just and the unjust, the good and the evil. But the edge is the labor of God through beauty and aspiration. That God sides with those beauty and aspiration. God sides with those values of justice and love and all that. God sides with them. And there's some people who would argue that indications of whether or not God sides with it is the fact that he's designed human beings such that they tend to prosper under conditions where those values prevail.
What you're saying seems to have implications. I'm thinking now about people who make pacifism a Christian virtue. But this tragic vision of God that you are laying out here seems to make Christianizing pacifism stupid.
Ambiguous. And it means an alternative as Christian remains possible. I don't think there's anything passive. Christian about being pacifist. I think it is. I don't think it's automatically. I've seen a lot of passive-aggressive people be pacifists.
It's a requirement, isn't it?
I find it morally reprehensible. That kind of hiding. Who was it? Achilles said in the Iliad, I hate hell's own gate, the man who speaks one thought while hiding another.
And you get a lot of that in Minnesota.
Yes, I've noticed that.
Yep.
It's I don't like it. It's not, and it's so obvious. It's so rancid. It smells the high heaven, but it's okay.
That was so Minnesota.
What?
It's okay.
I've been here too long already. But the point was, wait, remind me where I was going. You got me confused.
Well, I was thinking about people.
Pacifism, yeah.
That's, I just was.
Right.
And then passive.
So, yeah, so it's not exact necessarily Christian. I mean, sometimes it may be Christian of me to defend the vulnerable.
Mhm.
I mean, Moses killing the Hebrew was the act of a man who had the heart of a God. Now, eat on that one for a minute. It was the act of a man who had the heart of God. So sometimes, I mean, I just found it very funny. You know, Pat Robertson, he's one of my favorite people in the whole world. No, he really is. I mean,
Why?
I don't know what I'm going to do when he's gone. I'm serious too. But Pat Robertson would always would criticize presumptively Nelson Mandela and anybody black for resisting violently, defending themselves with the use of force in Africa, but then encourage assassination in South America. What a coward.
Right.
That's a moral, spiritual, physical coward. But I love him for his honest stupidity.
Is it honest stupidity?
Yes, and stupid honesty. He's so stupid, he doesn't see he's so biased that it short circuits his reason and he doesn't see the contradiction. He's that stupid. But the frightening part, of course, is that he can do that in America and
People love him.
Yeah, I know.
well, Sarah Palin.
Yeah.
My parents.
She's just.
They act like this is a revelation. Really? You just noticed this woman's slow? Well, she's been diagnosable from the beginning. The woman she's developmentally challenged. She really is. I mean, they shouldn't have done that to her. It's cruel. You know what it is? I remember my brother and them getting into a fight one time. Because I forget who it was, but somebody was developmentally challenged. Oh, I know who it was. They used to make him do things that he knew he couldn't do. And then they would laugh. They would smoke weed, and that was their group. But my brother and them got mad one day about them going too far with it, and they had a dispute. What they did to Sarah Palin, what American racism did to Sarah Palin was cruel. But they deserved it. But she should never have been put in the position that she's been put in. But she's never had to suffer the consequences of being put in it because of this delusional lie these people tell and act like it's okay. To act like George Bush wasn't developmentally challenged is absurd. And to make it like it was okay, no, that wasn't. The man could not, and I liked George Bush. I know there's something wrong with that, but I did. I hated his policy. I told my wife, I said, we're going to have the most fun we've ever had as adults politically in America unless something happens. That's what I said to her.
Yeah.
Before he got elected. Then we got 911. I said, oh, hell no, the jig is up now. Because he's a fool. But he's a fool like a fox. I'll give him that. Crazy like a fox. But Georgie boy, the fact that Americans sit around and act like we're not, and make us all, the media makes us all participate. Why? Because they can't admit that there's dumb white people.
Yeah.
That's all it comes down to. They cannot admit that because it undermines it. Listen, if there's such a thing as white supremacy, all white people have to be it. There's black inferiority. I don't care how smart you are as a black person, you have to be it. Otherwise, the model breaks down. So they can't write, so you can't have an honest evaluation of a George Bush, Sarah Palin too readily in this country because it threatens the foundation of the whole delusional apparatus. Because if certain things start going, it's going to be dominoes in this country. Because there is absolutely no reason for the obscene, disproportionate wealth distribution in this country. There's no reason for it. I ain't saying there ought not be some rich people. I'm all for rich people. I'm all for being one of them. If I work hard. But that's not the way it's set up. The obscene accumulation of wealth that we have at present is too much weight piled up and too small a point for the system not to collapse under the pressure. That's why you're getting that stuff in Greece, and it's the beginning of a domino. Don't let them fool you. It's going to show up in Britain next. Watch. It's going to skip Germany and go to Britain. Well, it's not just racial. I'm talking about the economic problem. No, the racial problem is really an outcropping or symptom of economic tensions most of the time in the West. The racial problem doesn't become a fault. The fault doesn't become apparent fault until you get the stress created by economic problems. Otherwise, people live with each other and going about their business. They're busy enjoying their stuff. When we can't get no things anymore, when we can't start taking our things away, we need something to be angry at. Each other.